Looks like we are live. Let me send some alerts to people. Looks like we're going to be talking about some pretty interesting stuff today. We're going to have a guest on to talk about the strike wave that's going on. Honestly, really amazed that we're living in these kind of times right now, because when I was a leftist 10 years ago, the thought that we'd be living in some kind of a strike wave just seemed like something straight out of 1910. But we're going to be discussing that with Paul KD from Tempest, who's been interviewing strikers to write an article on it for Tempest magazine. And so I figured he'd be a good person to come on and talk about this. So I'm going to get him on. Let me send him a invite. Let me warn everyone, this is my first time doing this. So I might have a few technical difficulties, but otherwise, I think I figured it out how to work on this. Up to 10 guests. All right, let's get this to Paul. All right, here we go. All right. So let me figure out, how do I find the chat for this Twitch thing? Chat overlay, social comments. Okay. Oh, I see. There's a chat thing over here. Oh, here we go. Here's Paul. Let's see. Oh, I just have to click this to add him to the stream. Hey, how's it going, Paul?
Hey. Hey, it's good. How are you?
Doing all right. I'm figuring out this whole Twitch platform. This is the first time I've actually run something on it, but hopefully things will go fairly smoothly. It's actually way easier than I expected. Like there's one central thing, Restream, and I guess it connects with Twitch and everything else. So yeah. So this should be broadcasting to YouTube and to Twitch as well. And
awesome.
Hold on, let me actually kind of ping this on our social media to get more people involved. All right. We are live now. All right, so Paul, maybe you could just kind of get started by introducing yourself, kind of talking about your organization Tempest, who I enjoy quite a bit, and maybe just kind of introduce the kind of work you're doing around the strike wave and what you've been writing about, what you've been learning about, because this is just it's really exciting times to be alive in, honestly.
Yeah, for sure. So my name's Paul KD. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm a member of Twin Cities DSA out here. I'm on the organizing committee of the labor branch out there. So I've been a participant of DSA for a while. Besides that, that's kind of my field of, one of the organizations I belong to. Besides that, I've been a labor activist since basically around senior year and kind of leaving college in 2018. I think similar to a lot of people, especially a lot of young people kind of entering the labor world, there was a couple experiences. Like there was a union drive that happened in my town that, I was like, oh, wow, this is really cool. I think that summer I'd read Jane McAlevy's Raising Expectations and Raising Hell. And I was like, wow, something from this, I just read about this kind of stuff, right? And then the West Virginia's teachers walkout really kind of, I was like, okay, that's so cool. I got to be doing whatever that is. That's the movement I want to kind of be in. So, so after that, I was, involved in a couple organizing drives that, didn't really go anywhere. And then starting around the pandemic, I started with other people in DSA. I joined up this group called the Restaurant Organizing Project, which is kind of a national network out of DSA's kind out of DSA's labor branch, creating kind of like a rank and file network of service industry workers. So that's been a lot of my organizing in terms of my organizing work. I'm also a member of UFCW 663, which is a local, we actually just took over, we just merged with Local 9 of the, the famous P9 of the Hormel strike in the 80s. So as, for labor nerds, that's maybe a little bit interesting. So it's a big UFCW local out here. I work at a co-op grocery store out here. Actually, I get to make sausages, which is really cool. And I'm a steward at my job there. So, so I have kind of starting to kind of doing some activism in my own workplace, as well as talking to and connecting with a lot of service industry workers. And that kind of, and I was kind of like looking for a place to, especially back in 2020, to discuss that and get really in depth and talk more about labor strategy, and be able to write down my thoughts and publish them and talk to other people and publish that, as well as just kind of being able to have discussions about the broader political scene we're living in. And that kind of led me to Tempest Magazine, which is, so we're a magazine, a zine. I'm kind of a 90s guy, so I like to say it's a zine.
Yeah, the zine culture.
Yeah.
I had an
exactly.
anarchist zine back in the day when I lived in Tampa called Subverts Unite, and I think we made
That's
like
awesome.
3 issues of it. Yeah, those were different times.
You gotta like send me. I want to see that sometime.
I don't know if I want anyone to see it, honestly.
That's fair. Yeah. Yeah. So we do that. We're just a website now, tempestmag.org. And then besides that, we're a full-on revolutionary socialist organizing project. It's kind of mostly a lot of people from. I'm kind of getting some reverb. So
let me mute myself, and I'll just unmute when you're talking. I think that will help.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Yeah. So it's a lot of people kind of primarily from the ISO and kind of out of the international socialist tradition, that kind of broadly socialism from below. And we have we have monthly discussions. We're not, it's, again, a lot of on the older age bracket. So Facebook Live is more of our thing, not Twitch. We have monthly kind of discussions on Facebook Live, where usually it's like a panel discussion followed by kind of a longer kind of everyone getting 2 minutes to weigh in on stuff. And yeah, I think I've published a couple of pieces with them. Both of them have been interviews. One with Kieran Knutson, who's a longtime revolutionary anarchist out here and president of the CWA 7250, which is reps AT&T workers out here. And I also did an interview with Adam Birch, who was a Metro Transit driver. He's also a Socialist Alternative member. He was a Metro Transit driver, which is the kind of public transit system out here in Minneapolis. And he and a few other people organized to refuse to drive buses for cops and other kind of law enforcement agencies during the uprising last summer, and also refusing to transport prisoners and arrested protesters in there, which frankly, like, is one of the things that like did a lot for the movement. And and considering that this sparked like a global movement, I think totally you can call him a working class hero. So I had an interview with him too, which is pretty cool.
Awesome.
I'm kind of stewing on this latest piece, which is I think, like you said, these are kind of interesting times. I think the really interesting thing about this current strike wave, which, whatever, I'll call it a strike wave, is that a lot of this is dealing with private sector places, which are not actually kind of written about as much anymore, right? Like a lot of the literature has been, a lot of it has been about, the decline of industrialization, but these are, a lot of private sector factory jobs in places that are kind of off the beaten road and places that are not discussed, right? Like I've been down in Waterloo the last 2 weekends, there are not a lot of, the only time that, newspapers come to these areas are like in like 2017 when they were doing like the hillbilly elegy, like, Joe the plumber in the rural, in the rural diner or something to say
I
type
saw
stuff.
the
So
I saw the shitty movie they made for that hillbilly elegy thing, and it was just like the worst I've ever seen. Like just really bad stuff.
yeah, I remember I saw an interview with like this is a side, but like, they did the Rose New York went on strike right in January and February, which is around 1,000, 2,000 Teamsters in the Bronx. They got like a pretty good contract out of that. And after that, coal miners, around 1,000 coal miners in Alabama have been on strike for around 7 months now with Warrior Met Coal. Beyond that, there is kind of a long protracted, I think they went out on strike maybe 3 times before finally signing a contract at a Volvo trucks plant in Southwest Virginia. There's the carpenter strike in Seattle and Western Washington. And then BCTGM, the bakery confectionery workers, have been on a lot of strikes, right? Like they struck at Frito-Lay in Topeka, they struck nationwide against Nabisco, and now they're on strike against Kellogg. And again, these are places, that are kind of, there's a kind of a lot of issues that have arisen that are in common that we don't hear about in, that just aren't written about enough, right? So I'm trying to kind of cover it. I think one thing that we can kind of say now is a pattern of workers rejecting tentative agreements. So this actually happened with the Warrior Met Coal strike in Alabama. I think it's happened in a couple other strikes in the Western Washington carpenter strike. I think they rejected. I think before they went on strike, it was the carpenters voted down 4 tentative agreements, and then finally the strike was over when they voted to end it with a new tentative agreement that was passed with a pretty small margin. The Frito-Lay workers in Topeka also had a similar thing where they voted down a tentative agreement, went on strike, and then the strike ended with a very small margin of in favor of accepting the new contract. So that's interesting because it shows that the workers are kind of maybe at a different place than maybe some of the labor leadership, right? Like, which, I think it doesn't, it isn't necessarily like, I think it's just a thing to note, right? We can talk about those political implications, but it's just kind of like a fact that we should take under consideration.
Right,
is that,
right.
Right. And we can talk about like reasons for that, but that's definitely a fact. I think the other thing that I wanted to address is that a lot of these have really exposed a lot of these have been about working conditions, right? Like not just pay or benefits, but really kind of long-term working conditions. Like the Frito-Lay one, I think really struck people because there's people working, like 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, some like these ridiculous hours. In the 80s and the 90s, there are these kind of like really epic strikes about this kind of stuff. I think the one what really stuck in people's mind was the Decatur War Zone, they called it, which was from like 92 to 94. 3 different factories in Decatur, Illinois, went on strike or lockout. And one of them, the Staley corn processing place, the question was about the company wanted to put in 12-hour rotating shifts. So the victory that the Frito-Lay workers in Topeka got was to move down to 12-hour rotating shifts from 16-hour, 7-day-a-week rotating shifts. So it's, I think it just shows we're at a different place, right? And I think that's really worth considering, also taking into account the thing that really struck people's attention earlier, which has been these kind of attempts to organize Amazon over the years. And I think we've seen a lot of press, especially from the kind of, the liberal media, about, these horrible working conditions at Amazon, like workers being forced to pee in bottles and delivery drivers peeing in bottles. Well, that's USPS drivers pee in bottles, UPS drivers pee in bottles. Anyone who's a delivery driver pees in bottles, right?
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
That's just the nature of the jobs right now. And then also the other thing is, I remember interview with I think her name is like Emily Gummelsberger or something. She wrote it's kind of like a spiritual sequel to Nickel and Dimed, and she mentions like working, like people saying that she talked to at Amazon talking about how the benefits were okay. And then she'd be like, okay, well, what's the benefits? And it would be something like, well, we can take unlimited unpaid time off. And she was like, that doesn't sound great. But, you know, if you're, a lot of these places, in order to get a job, like at John Deere, who I was just talking to, that's 7 months of probation. 7 months of probation where you can't take a day off. GM is a similar way from when I was there for the 2019 strike, talking to some of these people. You know, USPS, for example, people are basically temps for an undetermined amount of time between like 1 and 8 years as carriers, right? Like you can just be a temp for a while. And during that time on probation or when you're a temp, you don't get time off, right? Like the story I have is, you know, and then, you know, even when they have a contract at this Warrior Met coal strike in Alabama where 1,000 workers, they have a three strikes and you're out rule. So you can't have more than 3 absences in a year, I think. And that's, so unlimited unpaid time off actually sounds pretty good, right? So, you know, and not to be like, you know, that's just San Bezos, but I think we have to put that into context. Why like, you know, like right now, I think Amazon in my area is advertising for jobs at starting at like 18 an hour or something like that. You know, I'm making like 17.25 right now at my job, and the wages start at 15.25. You know, I think there's reasons why I like my job better than Amazon jobs, and the truth is that Amazon is also just the working conditions, right?
It's like
you really do wear people down.
From what I've heard.
But I think you actually have to consider that these wages are, you know, like in a lot of places, like a Target is the other example, right? Like Target's minimum wage is $15 an hour. In the South, like Kroger doesn't until, you know, USCW is renegotiating agreements with Kroger. They're not at 15 right now for starting part-timers, right? Like once you make it up to the butchery or, you know, you're kind of higher up in a grocery store, that's what you get to, but you're not making 15 starting out. And Target, you know, it's basically like a glorified grocery store. Starting at 15, they actually are kind of setting the wage. So, you know, I think the floor is so low and the conditions are so bad everywhere that it really does, this kind of stuff, you know, it resonates with people, but it also, I think, shows maybe the divide, right? So there's a divide between, you know, I think like work from home America, right? They can talk about and then, you know, I think some of these reporters interviewing, you know, I think it's just you have to actually kind of hang out in Waterloo for a while or hang out in these cities to really, really get how bad it is right now in these factories. Because, like, from what I can tell, from what I've heard, also, you know, from my own encounters, just talking to, you know, people I know, when you read a horror story, it's not the only place, right? And if it's a horror story from a place that has, in terms of working conditions, from a place that has a union contract, you know, you just know it's going to be worse in other places, right? So we have to kind of understand that when we're thinking about this.
Yeah, the thing about Amazon. Yeah, the thing about Amazon is, you know, it's like you said, it's $18 an hour, which is, I've had jobs that were $8 an hour, you know, so it doesn't seem that bad in terms of pure wages. But then you read about the working conditions there, and it's just like utter hell, just like a surveilled, grinding people into dust and just, you know, just turning people into pure automatons. And so, well, someone in the chat had a question, and it's Rudy actually, from CosmoNews. He says, if they're voting down tentative agreements, are we getting better agreements / conditions after? Which I think is an important question to be asking here.
Yeah, I think overall, yeah, because, you know, I think for one, there's like a National Labor Relations Board. In terms of one of like the rules is, you know, you have to be making progress on these agreements. So I think that's, you know, it is a policy a lot of times that, you know, companies will ignore that. But in terms of the negotiations overall, yeah, I think like with the carpenters in Western Washington, it was like, you know, they got gradually better contracts as it went along. I think you can kind of looking at sometimes, you know, like there's the highlights of the contract and then there's the full detail. Like the contracts between, my contracted work is maybe 20 pages. The contract, like John Deere, for example, you have a big master agreement, which is, I think there's like 12 locals, maybe like 14 different locations, different kind of cities around the country where John Deere is on strike. So there's a master agreement and then the local agreement. So it's a really, really big, long agreement, right? So I think you can imagine in the negotiation process, right? Like, okay, well, these workers voted it down, so we'll give them a higher wage, but we'll maybe like give a concession here. So I think overall we're definitely seeing better contracts once they vote it down. But I think that's true this year. But I will say that hasn't always been the case, right? Like it was a really common tactic in the 80s and the 90s, and I think continuing on to the 2000s, of a company proposing like just like a really bad agreement, everyone voting it down. So and then the company going on strike, and the company basically just waiting out the strike, waiting for a year. And once you kind of have been on strike for a year, the scabs that have been brought in can vote to decertify the union, and then they either doing that or make them basically make them suffer, right? Like have them sit out in the cold for a while, and then they'll accept the original agreement. I think this happened. The one that I think is a recent example of this that I want to bring up is this is actually up in Canada, but this refinery in, I think, Saskatchewan went on strike for 6 months in 2020. And at the end, what they got was the original agreement that they went on strike over, plus a return to work agreement. Right. So it's basically like okay, we'll come back, but we'll get, you'll promise not to fire us from our jobs, which is kind of important, right? Because when a company, that's the company's goal in that was to defeat the union. So you have to kind of there are some times where once you go and there's a phrase in that you'll always hear labor unions say this, which is one day longer, one day stronger. Most of the time, unfortunately, that isn't actually the case, right? Especially, I think hospitals are a pretty classic example, but you can think about other examples of this, right? When a scab comes in, so a replacement worker, what do you do on your first week at work? You're not very good, right? But you kind of get trained into it. So the longer that a company can outlast a strike, especially if they're able to get these scabs in and able to get people working in there, then they can wait out. They usually, like John Deere has $6.5 billion in profit, right? So the key is, if they can wait it out for a little bit amount of time, but workers do not. Strike pay is usually around, right now at John Deere, it's around $275 a week. They're getting, they get a lot of community support, which is really important, but we have to understand, these are really big sacrifices. So when you think about some of these epic strikes, here in Las Vegas, the casino workers at a casino, I think were on strike for maybe 8 years. Think about that's, eventually a lot of those strikers just, got other jobs to subsidize or whatever. But especially, since the 90s and the cut in welfare benefits, imagine, that's a really big sacrifice for workers. And I think we have, so strikes are, it's really, there's this kind of, duality where you want to cheer them on and be like, wow, support them as much as you can. But you have to understand that these, and this factors into why we've seen a decline in strikes is they're really hard decisions for people to take, because you are taking you're accepting a pay cut. You're accepting a really unknown future by going out on strike. So yeah, we should really support it to the hilt when that happens because of that.
Yeah, that's one thing that I think is a lot of people need to understand is community support is, winning a strike. It really often does rely on rallying the community around you and getting people involved and who otherwise wouldn't be involved in the strike, and kind of showing that it's, not just the interest of this specific sector of workers, but, the entire community has something at stake here. And I think that's definitely something to keep in mind. One thing, it's just, when I was originally getting into the left, and it felt like labor was the labor movement, like there was a lot of arguments and debates about like whether the labor movement was kind of basically just dead. Because if you look at charts showing strike activity and union density in the United States since the 1980s, it just felt like it was a straight line down. But I think with this strike wave, I think it's worth asking the question, like, is this a change in that trend, or is it just like a kind of momentary like bump up, and then maybe it's just kind of a freak accident almost, or are we seeing like an actual reversal of that trend, an actual kind of incident of the class kind of regaining its feet in the new terrain that it's found itself in, and actually kind of rebuilding its capacity to act as as a capable force on the shop floor? That might be a bit too much. It's a very big question.
That's a good question. And I can't really. I don't know if I'm sure either way.
Yeah, I mean, we know what we want the answer to be. Like, we know we want right? it to be. We want to think of this as like a new beginning.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true, and I think there's also, we can look at different industries and see different things happening. Like, it's undeniable that teachers right now are more militant than they have been since the late 80s, right? Like, growing up, I grew up in the suburbs of Maryland. Like, I was kind of growing up at the time of Michelle Rhee in DC, and that has been just a major, major shift. Seeing the actual public opinion change and seeing teachers become more militant and less beaten down has been a big shift. And I think we saw that in the pandemic, right? Like, why were schools one of the last industries to reopen in a lot of places? Because they have strong unions, right? Like, that's just true, I would tell this to other service industry workers. I'm like, look, do restaurant workers have unions? No, they're one of the first to reopen. Do schools have unions? Yes, they're one of the last to reopen, right? So, there's that. On the other hand, the labor movement, there is this kind of thing where we have to, like, I have been reading a lot of stuff from the 90s and the 2000s right now. And then, in 96, John Sweeney became president and a reform slate took over. There in 97, there was a UPS strike, which is, it's just massive. Kerry there was the victory of TDU and reformers in the Teamsters. There's a wildcat in the early 90s, a wildcat drywall strike that unionized the whole Southern California drywall industry. There is the Detroit newspaper strike, which lasted for like 2 years and was just incredibly militant before the workers there were defeated. So, I think, but in the turn, like, you would never hear a leftist be like, oh man, I would love to get back to like those times of the militant 90s, right? Like, yeah. So it has not been a growth industry, right? So, I think we have to put this in context. Also, like, well, it's really great we're seeing a lot more workers going on strike, but it feels kind of weird to be like, if we all push a little bit harder, we're going to be back in the golden days of like 1993 America, right? Like, yeah, that feels a little weird to say, right? So I think it's just like at the peak, 1% of the country was having union elections every year. This was in the 60s, I think. 1% of the American workforce was involved in union elections. So that was besides like the people who were in, already in unions. That, like, think about how much that would take, how much more energy that would take. As someone who has kind of been involved in organizing campaigns, imagining 1% of all workplaces, being involved in these campaigns it's just like, it's so much, it's a lot more than we're at right now. So we have to take that into consideration. I did want to actually talk about community support a bit, because that's a really interesting question, because again, these being private sector strikes have made this a little bit different. Like, public sector strikes, community support is really critical. That's where the kind of bargaining for the common good idea comes in, that kind of concept. And that's been just unbelievably critical in a lot of ways. Like, teachers it really caused an opinion shift for teachers to be like, we're on strike for our students. And that was actually, it took effort from the teachers unions, right? Like, out here in St. Paul a few years ago, it was when the Super Bowl was hosted here, I think, because the idea was that they were going to go on strike during the Super Bowl. So maybe 2017. St. Paul teachers came really close to a strike. They actually did go on strike at the beginning of 2020. But I want to talk about the one in 2017 because the school board was like, look, we don't. They were on strike because they wanted to have, I think it was a nurse it was something like a nurse in every school, or maybe a librarian in every school. And the school board said, well, we could do that, but then we wouldn't be able to give you guys a raise. And it was just a negotiating tactic because they thought that they would be like, they thought the workers would vote that down, and then they'd be like, oh, look, we wanted to give, parents, we wanted to give your students a librarian, but the teachers wanted a raise. Well, the teachers were like, okay, sure, like we can, like we'll cut our, so they lowered down their offer and basically called their bluff. So I think earlier this year in the, out here, especially around the protests around in Brooklyn Center earlier this year around Dante Wright, but last year in the uprising, like the teachers unions out here were, they're professional workers in Minnesota, very, very white, right? At least compared to, and especially compared to the working class out here, the kind of bottom rungs of the working class, I should say. The teachers unions out here were really fantastic, and I think you can talk about that. The nurses union out here was not great on racial stuff. So that idea is really critical. For private sector strikes, it's a little bit different, right? Because you can get. I think that a lot of that actually has happened a lot, where like it's actually kind of a bad thing in some circumstances. I had a friend who was organizing his art museum in up in Maine, and he was like, he had read Jane McAlevey, and he's like, I'm going to try and get, I'm going to go see if we can get some of the churches on our side, some of the faith groups. I'm going to talk to some community groups. And his organizer from the union was like, well, have you talked to everyone at your workplace yet? And he's like, no. And he was like, okay, we have a priority, right? Because, you can, if everyone in Minneapolis is like, John Deere sucks, don't buy John Deere. Well, that's great, but the tractors cost, some of these tractors are, the combines cost like up to $1 million. Like, a consumer boycott is like that. Consumers aren't buying that, right? Those are really big products. So, where the community support does come in is the issue of injunctions, which I want to talk about, because that is a common thing that happens it happened in Davenport this week, and that really, really does hurt strikes, because they go to what companies do is they don't go to national courts, they go to state courts, and state court in Iowa, it's like rich Republican heiress as the local judge or whatever. And in Davenport, they said that they were like violating, traffic laws or whatever, and creating an unsafe environment by, picketing, right? Walking across the street. So now, so the judge banned burn barrels, which is just awful, right? Like, and especially when you're thinking about this starting to be the winter, you need some heat out there. So burn barrels are, they're basically big oil drums where you put logs in, and it makes it pretty warm. So now the whole local had to like put all of those back in the union hall and buy a bunch of propane tanks, right? So they banned that. They banned chairs. So now workers can't have to stand up. They can't sit down while they're on the picket line for their like 6-hour shift. And they said only 4 people at a time can be there, and they have to be very spaced out. So that is basic trying to break a strike. Injunctions kind of don't go on the community. So that's where the community can come in. Like there was a community rally against injunctions in Waterloo, not in Waterloo, in Davenport. That was really great. But there's things like that, like community support actions. Again, what what we were talking about earlier with mutual aid, that really comes through. Because a lot of times injunctions can target the union, but there's a lot of things that, like someone can say like it's not illegal to drive very slowly in front of a truck carrying goods outside of a factory, right? You're just as a especially if you're a little old lady, right? Little old ladies drive really slow. That's not against the law, right? So a community could do that. The union, of course, the union can't do anything because, right, unions can't break the law because that would be illegal. So they can't do that because breaking the law is no one supports doing crimes.
No one
I
does
wanted
that.
to clarify that.
We're all good communists here.
Yeah. But so there's things that the community can do. So that is really important and critical. And then we're socialists, right? So we have the idea of like bringing in an analysis to the table and stuff like that. So that stuff is important. But I do want to say, like, I've been at so many, like yesterday, I've been at a lot of like picket lines where they bring in the local politicians to be like, the community has your back, and you're like, okay, well, like, what does that mean? Like, because the whole community can stand behind Frito-Lay. I don't think anyone was going to be like, oh, no one was in support of Frito-Lay in that strike. But at the end, all they got once they moved from 16-hour days down to 12-hour days, right? Which I don't think is what the workers were fighting for. So we need a little bit more than that.
Yeah, I think, often like the problem is just apathy. Like people just, that's just their issue. It's their problem. It's not really our concern what these workers in this private sector, area are doing. But I don't know. It's very frustrating. One thing I want to talk about was kind of like the kind of division between the rank and file of the unions and the labor bureaucracy here, because I think that's one thing that has really stuck out to me, is that you're actually seeing a lot of conflict between these two forces here. It's not just like these strikes aren't like some kind of controlled show of force by the bureaucracy or whatever. It really are seeing like a rank and file initiative take place. From what I can tell, at least. Maybe that's just a misinterpretation of what's going on my part.
No, I mean, for the John Deere strike, so John Deere, they had a strike authorization vote that passed with like 95% of the vote, and then at the last minute, John Deere and UAW came to an agreement. That agreement was voted down by 90%. I don't think that there was some like it was a grand scheme by the UAW to like give them this deal and then have it voted down, and that'll really get them united. Like, no, they I think we can really say that was what that was. That was a really big rejection of the agreement. That doesn't, I think we can talk about divide. When we talk about the divide, my fellow comrade in the Tempest Collective, Charlie Post, has kind of always talks about it as a sociological issue, which I think is really important, right? Because, there's kind of these ideas of like, these like labor bureaucrats, having, being like misleaders of the workforce. But we also have to think about like, okay, well, someone at UAW who's like, on the bargaining committee, they're not working, they don't have to worry about their pension going away, right? They don't see the effects of how the kind of divisions that a two-tier workforce causes. They are probably not making $20 an hour. They're probably making a little bit more than that. So what they can see as like they're in an environment of decline, right? Like if you're a staffer at, especially for the industrial sector of UAW, for the manufacturing sector, if you're a staffer for them, you've been in an environment of decline, right? So you see this agreement and you're like, okay, well, we beat back the concessions the company wanted. We have, general wage increases. This is what we can do. This is the best we can do. And maybe and then, maybe in a few years we'll be more united, and then we can really, really, really push. A worker doesn't really see it that way, right? A worker, especially if you've been there for 5 years, you're like, this sucks, man. The shirt, I saw these guys wearing these shirts yesterday in Waterloo that I loved, that said, it said, deemed called essential in 2020, proven in 2021, John Deere can't build it alone, which is really like, people really, really felt that, right? Like being called an essential worker and then being told the next year, like, oh, well, this is what you get. That doesn't fly with people, right? So we have to really consider that, right? And really understand what that meant. I think the other thing that you think of that I see, and I think you can kind of see this on the left sometimes. When people, I think one thing we have to understand that militancy isn't always tied in with left wing, right wing, right? Like people at work don't only see work issues as corresponding with their politics.
Right.
And I have a friend who is an organizer for a union and was telling me about so factory of around 700 people, and the company has a really, really strong mask mandate. They're like, you must wear a mask. If you don't wear a mask, you'll be disciplined. You'll be suspended. It's in rural Minnesota, mostly white. No one wears a mask. So yeah, very militant, right? But
Right,
that's not
right,
cool.
yeah.
Like, guys, wear a mask. So and if you're and if especially if you're kind of like an entry level staffer, kind of your first, and like I think just a lot of the labor movement, you have to understand, is kind of like that, right? Like there are a lot of areas where the workers are just more conservative than the management, than the leadership in some ways. So you can kind of, I think you can, if you're in that world, militancy can sound like a different thing.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that we need to hark on is people can have militant tactics for politically right-wing ends. Like the kind of the mask example that you're pointing out is totally totally lines up with that example. I mean, there's a whole history of absolutely wretched hate strikes and whatnot in the United States, and so I think it's something to really take into account as how do you you know how do you channel union militancy that would into a more socialist direction when you have like a kind of conservative workforce. And I don't know if there's really there's no quick solution to that other than like the long patient work of political education, political struggle. And I think a lot of people like to say that every time like unions do something bad, it's because of the union leadership. But I mean, as you pointed out, it's often the union leadership is more politically conscious than the rank and file in many cases. Like it's not always the case, obviously. In many cases, it's the opposite. But you have to really look at every particular incident and really look at the different forces at play. And it's really hard to make generalizations about these kind of situations.
Yeah. And now here's my like Stephen A. Smith, but
Yeah.
but we actually have to talk about this because it is straight up true, and a lot of times that we've seen around this year, I think we've seen the leadership of unions being much more conservative and much less ready to strike. And again, and we have to like what I mean by political being different. Like we also have to understand like. You can be militant for right-wing ends, but you could also be militant for like the right reasons, like wanting a raise on your job, but be politically right-wing, right? Like, yeah. So we have, and that actually, like there, I've seen, this Volvo strike in where Virginia was basically, it was disastrous by the UAW. So because that already finished, I want to examine what happened there, and then we can talk about John Deere a little bit more because I've been talking to some of the people there. But in Waterloo, this is in Dublin, Virginia, so kind of near in the southwest, kind of near Virginia Tech. So they come to an agreement. Everyone votes it down. So I think they go to it. The union then puts out another agreement. They vote it down. They go on strike. They go on strike during the chip shortage. Remember the chip shortage for earlier this year? So. The company was basically Volvo Trucks was planning to lay idle for the 2 weeks that they were on strike anyway. So they're like, great, now we don't have to pay you. We were going to pay you while, we left you idle. Now you're just on strike. They came back, they had an agreement that basically didn't change anything. So they went out on strike again. Then they came for another week, they came to an agreement again. They voted it down again. And then 2 days later, the UAW said to the workers, well, the company has decided to stop negotiating. So we're going to vote on this agreement again, or else, right? Yeah, they basically said without words, vote until you get it right. This was happening. We saw this in the Western Washington carpenters strike. Like, we can just say what that was, right? We have to be really honest about this. They went through four tentative agreements. They kept on voting it down. The rank and file kept on voting it down. Eventually, for the fourth one, the carpenters union tied it to a strike authorization vote. So, like, if you vote this down, we go out on strike. They thought that meant then no one will really want to go out on strike, but they voted it down, so they had to go out on strike. It turned out as soon as that happened, it turned out that only 2,000 out of the 12,000 workers would go out on strike because the rest are under project labor agreements with a no strike clause, even under a contract site, no strike clause. So 10,000 of the 12,000 weren't on strike, and the union said, oh, you're gonna get docked 25% of your pay that will go into the strike fund. So they're like, you have to work, but only for 75% of your wages, but you're working for the people that were negotiating against it. Doesn't make it. That's a strike. That's a punishment, right? So that happened. And then, there's a video I saw that, which I think is, we really have to watch that and be like, what is going on in these unions? Because it was on the first day of the strike because they only announced like they're going to picket like 4 sites. And they had the principal officer of the union went down and was talking to the rank and file, because there was actually a rank and file group, the Peter J. McGuire group, that was kind of organizing against these contracts. And the person said, well, you have to understand, with strikes, you have to start out slow and then build up momentum. That's actually the exact opposite of what you want to do with a strike. Yeah. You don't want you want to stop production.
Yeah, exactly. Right? It's all about shutting down production, interrupting.
Yeah, you don't slowly shut down production.
We could.
Workers don't get paid during strikes. You want them to be quick so the workers can get back on the job and start getting paid again. Right.
You don't want the prolonged strikes forever.
So I think in Waterloo, we have to really understand the political context to really understand what's going on. Because I was down there yesterday, and they had a rally that was the Waterloo rally. It was great, right? Like they had like a local pastor. They had other people, they had a guy from the Teamsters who gave a great speech. Other labor leaders. There's still in Waterloo in Eastern Iowa. There's still these kind of elected Democrats. They had give speeches, and they were good speeches, right? But this is Waterloo and all of Eastern Iowa. That was like a stronghold of labor Democrats, right? Like I actually we got lunch afterwards with these retired guys from CWA, and they're giving us all these stories about Paul Wellstone coming down and giving speeches, and how they endorsed Bernie in 2016 and all this stuff. And it was good to hear. But that's kind of changed, right? Like they've moved from being a really solidly blue area to a pretty red area since 2016. And the workers, they were talking about in the speech, the workers, from all anyone to say, are pretty split politically. And, it's 3,000 people in Waterloo, right? So it's going to be split no matter what. And I've been on the line, and it's also Waterloo is just for anywhere a very diverse town. Like it has a very large, it actually has a very large Black population, and a lot of Bosnian workers too. So, the picket lines are actually pretty diverse. Big diversity of beliefs, right? Like I saw people, I talked to a person who was a 3rd generation John Deere worker, a Black woman. Her parents had met on the job. She was telling me they needed like a workers' revolution across America, and talking about how much the Kellogg strike inspired her, and et cetera. It was so wonderful to hear. I heard some really great stories. And I also, I talked to some people that I could tell were, probably Trumpers, were kind of in it, they're on strike because everyone else is, but, maybe they weren't as down to go out and strike.
But I can see Trumpers being into a strike. It's like, we're gonna do the equivalent of the Capitol riot, but for our workplace.
And it doesn't even have to be, right? Like I've been on the picket line with like guys who are really militant and really want to go on strike, but are also like, really, like QAnon types or whatever. That isn't, I think we have to understand, like, they don't view that necessarily. They view that as kind of like, oh, well, that's my politics, but on strike, but like the company's trying to screw me over, so there's different issues. But this, they were like, oh, the whole labor movement has your back. The strike, the people were saying that. Then they went on the picket line. We all kind of went out together to the picket line, talked to these workers, had a great time. But the workers rejected the tentative agreement by more than 90% of the vote in this place. And they're saying, like, oh man, we have your back with UAW. Well, there's clearly some disconnect. Also, the brand of the kind of like labor democratic brand that the leadership was really talking about and is connected to, and is connected with these senators. And, we were these types of guys who retired CWA staffers were like, we're in the GSA, we kind of came out of the Bernie movement. They're like, oh yeah, I'm a pretty liberal guy. I kind of, I'm kind of a bleeding heart guy myself, right? I love Bernie, right? Well, that isn't buying it for these workers. Aren't buying that, so we have to try something different. Which I it brings me back to we need to start talking about independent politics and independent political power and distinct independent socialist political power, because I'm sorry, but like if we're tying ourselves to the to the labor leadership and the left wing of these kind of old school blue collar labor Democrats, like I love talking to those people. I really have a lot of like Paul Wellstone was I have a lot of respect for people like Paul Wellstone, et cetera. In Minnesota, you hear all of these stories from people, about him fighting in the farm crisis, et cetera, et cetera. But we have to understand that that brand failed. Like blue collar, Rust Belt Democrats are not doing well. They're doing horribly, and young people are not really relating to them, right? And when they're in the leadership of the unions, they're going against them pretty much all the way. Workers in there was a lot of interviews with union leaders back in 2020 about how, well, our workers are all going to vote Republican, or either split or going to vote for Republicans. So we're just, going to try our best with the ones we got. But, if you can't get your workers to vote the way you want them to vote, if you're, in the labor leadership, if they're voting down your contracts, right, then, as socialists, we actually have to, it actually is incumbent on us to give us give a different, a different analysis and different solution. We have to be very careful about that, of course, because people want to be united in a strike. You don't want to have this, outside agitator coming in and being like, yeah, I hear your union bosses are really screwing you over. That's what, but we actually have to mention it because right now, again, final thing I'll say on this little rant is the only people if you Google, it's really awful, but if you Google these strikes, a lot of times one of the first few results you get is from this fucking World Socialist website, which because they don't actually go to these places, but they troll the Facebook pages and they write up comments and they write some awful article or whatever. UAW, they haven't written about. UAW wrote. I checked on their Facebook and their Twitter. They have a post that's like, they have a press release that the workers are on strike, and they put up a one sentence thing that they're continuing negotiations this week. It was negotiations update. We're continuing negotiations. Do you think that a union that knew what it was doing would put out a giant press release when a judge banned them from having chairs at a picket line, bans them from lighting fires to keep themselves warm? You think that a union would put out a press release talking about this? UAW didn't put out anything talking about this. They haven't written about. They haven't released this. So a guy who's doing, besides the World Socialist website, there's the local news, which everyone at the picket line was telling me was just spreading lies. No surprise that the local NBC affiliate isn't doing a great job covering this. And then Jonah Furman, and I love we love Jonah. Bless his heart. Jonah Furman and Labor Notes are doing really good work. But we can't really rely on one guy to be the labor, or Jonah Furman or Kim Kelly, Hamilton Nolan, Connor Lewis. There's some pretty good labor journalists out here who are doing a really good job covering it. But I kind of know, but I know all of them. I follow both of them on social media, right? This should be a whole field of stuff, and there should be regular people writing about it, and it just isn't happening. So we really, really need to be talking about this. Okay, one last. Now that I'm really, you got me going. One last thing. My one mention of DSA during this. So I talked about this injunctions in this picket line. The one time DSA has any conversation about these strikes is on some kind of red state, blue state, factional battle over some about that. It's just really more about some power interfactional power struggle in DSA. If people are listening to this, they might know what I'm talking to.
Yeah, I know. You're talking about the Quad Cities thing, right?
Yeah, you can search on Twitter if you want to. Just search Quad Cities DSA, and you'll see I'm well, I don't see all the Des Moines DSA has been doing an awesome job of the picket line. Chicago DSA did a trip with UAWD, the UAW Reform Caucus, down to the Quad Cities. We in Twin Cities DSA have gone down a couple of weekends in a row. there are like DSA people doing really great work. There's a couple of like, at-large, there's an at-large DSA member at John Deere in Ottumwa, who's doing, DSA has been doing good work where it is locally, but we're not having like a big nation. DSA is not having like a big conversation about this. Like it isn't like, it isn't, the labor strategy is not talked about to the degree of like, even to the degree, I don't think electoral strategy is really talked about deeply enough in DSA.
No, yeah,
But
don't get me
it's
started
so
on
much
that.
more than, yeah, right. Like, but like, again, like, I really hate to say, man, I wish we could talk about, I wish we could talk about labor the way that we talk about like electoral politics in DSA. It's the same as saying, I wish labor was like what it was in the 90s, right? Like, it sounds really bad coming out of your mouth, but but as socialists, we really need to be talking about that. And so yeah, like, if you're interested, get involved in the labor movement, like we need you.
Yeah. I think, it's about DSA, like, I was really frustrated by the one labor resolution they had at the convention. I actually have an article coming out, like very late article about like touching on the convention, but like it just felt like the labor resolution really had no real direction or purpose. It was just kind of like, here's a list of all the good things that we believe in, and there was a big discussion about whether or not there should be like a stance taken against the labor bureaucracy, and all these people were kind of just saying, oh, we can't say mean things about the labor bureaucracy. The workers will get mad at us, and they won't listen to us. We have to support their union leaders if we want to get their trust. And yeah, I think recent events are kind of showing that to be wrong, but I really do agree that there needs to be more serious discussion about labor strategy at a national level in DSA, because DSA is doing great work right now and doing strike support work. I don't want to deny that. I mean, I think, with the Quad Cities thing, there's a lot of internal division there. And on that issue, I'm pretty much with the people who are trying to do the rally, because I think unless the people who are trying to organize that rally are completely lying, it does sound like they were in contact with rank and file workers who wanted their support, and it was the union leadership who was basically trying to clamp down on that. But regardless, I think everyone could agree that there does need to be a more concerted and strategic approach to labor in DSA. And I think we need to start talking about, like what we were saying earlier, of the failure of these kind of labor Democrats to really provide adequate leadership. I think it's a political question as well. And I think the more DSA is kind of tied to the Democratic Party and just seen as like the left wing of the Democratic Party, the harder it is for us to really wage the kind of political struggle for the leadership of the labor movement that we need to do. So yeah, that's just my 2 cents on the whole thing.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly. I think I'm totally with that. Again, I will say, as someone who does labor work in DSA, I think is great. Like, everyone who is doing, I don't know anyone who's doing it like where I'm like, wow, that's really bad, stop doing that, right? Like, everyone, but beyond that, like, we're like a lot of really dedicated people. So I have a lot of appreciation for all the people who have been doing strike support. I think, as long as we're talking about this, we should, I did see some, like, we need to, UAWD is doing their UAW, because of these, we can go into it, but there's a bunch of kind of corruption scandals. They've kind of signed an agreement with the feds to have a referendum on whether to install a one-member, one-vote voting system, as opposed to the current where you vote for delegates who go to a convention who vote for leadership, right? It would be for what the Teamsters and other unions do, which is you get a ballot, like most organizations, right? You get a ballot and you vote for the president and the vice president and the secretary treasurer and et cetera, et cetera. There's a referendum on whether we should adopt that system. I actually just got a text yesterday from my friend who just got into grad school at UC Davis, who was like, hey, you're a union guy, tell me about this ballot I just received, because surprise, surprise, UAW isn't telling it. They're just kind of hoping their membership ignores it. The leading administration, the administration caucus, they call themselves. UAWD is the kind of reform group that's been doing a lot of work in this. I mean, that is really inspiring, right? Because UAW right now, I think 20% of its membership is academic workers. You can imagine that academic workers are a little bit more, there's a little more of a concentration of DSA members there than there are in in the factory workers. Although, there are some, I don't want to discount that. But seeing, it's a really great, potential this is like the PMC and the blue collar workers coming together for this reform effort. So I want to hype out that you can donate to them. I really suggest you would. If you have if anyone is listening is a UAW member or knows someone, like I said, like if you know someone who's like a grad student at in the University of California system, they can probably vote in this election. It doesn't have to be like a Ford worker, although if you do, get them involved in this and get that, because that is going to be really necessary. The administration, again, what like if there's any I think I kind of became one thing that you really learn is both kind of thinking about labor leadership, but also leadership in states in general and other places. Like you always ask with the Arab Spring, how did these guys last for so long? How did a guy Hosni Mubarak was hated by everyone, stay in power for so long? And ruling parties and ruling classes, if they know how to stay in power, that's the one thing they can do, right? So, and they know how to clamp down on militancy. The administration caucus of the UAW, which has been in leadership since the 40s, was started to clamp down on militancy, right? That is the one thing, that is their be all end all goal. And it's the one thing they've been doing that they've been succeeding at since the 40s. They've not been succeeding at growing the union. They've been succeeding at clamping down militancy. They're really good at that, and they're really experienced. And they can be pretty crafty. So we have to watch out for that, and when there are reform efforts, we really have to support them. I think UAWD is really great. There's the election in the Teamsters between Sean O'Brien and Verma, I forget his first name. I think it would be great to see new leadership going there as well. I think Sean O'Brien is maybe not the best reform candidate we could imagine, but that I think could be a positive development as well. So yeah, there's some good stuff happening, and also for one more thing, I've seen a lot. I think one thing a lot of beginners say is well, should I go join a union? Or they kind of counterpose being in the rank and file of a union or organizing new unions. Quick story, out here, we've had a lot of success working with Local 17, the Unite Here local out here, organizing brewery and distillery workers. We're at a really good place right now where if you know someone who's a brewery or distillery worker in the Twin Cities, or honestly anywhere, hit them up, get them connected to me. I'll get them connected to people who have organized their workplaces, who are doing their same jobs, who can kind of lead you through the process. And the thing that has made that really worthwhile and has made it successful is that Local 17 was a reform slate took over in I think 2016 or 2017. They cut all of one thing they did that is really cool is they cut all their salaries in half and used that money to hire new organizers. And they're really committed to organizing in the service industry. In addition to the usual Unite Here targets of hotels and big cafeterias and et cetera. So it is really connected, right? A bad union isn't going to be that good at taking in new workers, really that appealing, right? I know people who are in grocery stores who have been who have said to me, well, I hear USCW isn't that great where I'm at, right? If the unionized grocery store right next to me is making they're making less money than I'm making, then why should I form a union? So we need to do both, right? It is kind of a symbiotic relationship. So if you're in a workplace you think you can unionize, do it. If you want, if you're near a strike line, go to it, talk to the workers, ask them what they want. Literally ask them, talk to them. Make them the protagonists, right? If you're a John Deere workers in Waterloo, the idea that someone would drive down to from 3.5 hours from the Twin Cities to talk to them because they're impressed by them was really surprising to them. But it's the biggest strike going on in the country. There's $150 million a week going through these companies. I make sausages. It's all part of the food train, right? I've been reading Max Aisle, right? Food is important.
Yeah.
He doesn't like Tempest, but I like him. Whatever. Food is important. This is really, really cool, guys. And they're oh, yeah, I guess we are cool, right? giving these people the confidence this can really give people the confidence. So yeah, but definitely, get involved somehow.
One last question. I think we're going to move on to a different segment of this program. Is how much of this whole strike wave, striketober, I don't know what we want to call it, mass strike, not really, I guess. I don't know. That's the whole way of categorizing these things. It's like I've seen people call it a general strike, which I don't really think is accurate. But like, how much do you think it's related to like the labor shortage situation, kind of giving workers a little bit more leverage than they normally would have, and kind of giving and creating kind of ground floor situation where people can take more risks than usual, and kind of creating the situation where actually, like, a labor market that was incredibly hostile towards striking is a bit less hostile right now.
Yeah, like so John Deere back in 2016, the last time they had their contract, it wasn't that great of a contract, but it passed by a couple hundred votes because John Deere, the company, offered a sign-on bonus, and so like over, I think maybe 2,000 of the workers were laid off. So that meant that if they weren't going back, they might not be going back to work, but since they're still on layoff, they're on the layoff list, they got $3,500. They're like, yeah, whatever, like, right? So they signed that, so the contract passed. This year, they have like 600 openings in Waterloo, they're telling me. And before, like, people weren't getting hired, and you had to, and they said, like, you're in 7 months probation, and if you like, if you came in 10 minutes late, they'd fire you. Now the guy said that the people on the people on probation, like, they're letting them, do whatever they want. They're like, please just last as long as you can. So that has really given workers some leverage in some circumstances. And I think that, I mean, like, you drive around fast food restaurants, either they're saying, like, either they're only open, like, I drove on the way down, we stopped in Rochester, Minnesota. I went to the Caribou. I was going to go get some caffeine, and it was closed on weekends and only open mornings during the week, and then closed on weekends because they can't get anyone to work at the Caribou coffee in like suburban Rochester, right? So that's and we're seeing people like getting offered I had a worker out in like rural Colorado who worked at like a combination like Taco Bell and Pizza Hut, like the song or whatever. She was like, I'm not getting paid enough. We should like form a union so we get paid more. I'm like, okay, great. So like start talking to your coworkers. I call her a week later. She's like, well, the places next to us were offering $5 an hour more than we were. So let's just raise all of our wages. So I'm like, oh, so you like went up to her and you told her that? Oh no, she just raised our wages. We didn't even have to do anything, right?
Oh, wow.
Workers have a lot of power in that way. I think, the kind of wave of like people, what they call it, the great resignation, like people just quitting and moving around. That's really powerful. That's like a really good possibility. So I think it's related. On the other hand, you can imagine where this could go wrong, right? Like, okay, well, companies can kind of get used to like the way in the grocery store business, since it's kind of my field now, I've been thinking about it, like Aldi has a higher starting wage than most union grocery stores. Like Aldi is like maybe starts like 18 or 19 an hour. Well, they only have 3 workers in the store. Imagine 3 workers in a grocery store in a whole Aldi. Not that fun, right? So you work your butt off for like 6 months and you get burnt out and you quit, and they get 3 more people. Eventually, I think you can get, if the labor market stabilizes and people are able to and they're able to kind of get that going, then like at my unionized workplace, they're like, oh well, we have so many we have so many like we have so many openings, just we're all going to have to pitch in a little bit more, right? Like, well, if that kind of stabilizes and continues, and everyone is just doing more with less, then that's going to end up being, that can end up being bad. So we have to be on the lookout to make sure that doesn't stabilize. But right now, yeah, I think it's totally plausible that this is a knock-on effect.
Yeah, I think like a lot of people are saying, "Oh, this labor shortage is so bad," blah blah blah. It's like, no, this is good. Like you know, I mean, obviously, like you said, it can go wrong, but like overall, like this is puts workers in a better position to ask for more. So I'm all for it. It might be bad for business, but what's bad for business is often what's good for us. So,
Yeah. Yep.
so
Exactly. Right. Like when the guy was like, this, he talked to this, and then the caribou was closed, so I had to go to the Panera, and the Panera had like limited out. They only had like one bagel, and it was like vanilla cranberry or some bullshit Goya bagel like that, and I'm like, what? And the guy's like, oh man, this labor shortage, let me tell you. And I'm like, well, if the jerk off in charge of like the suburban Rochester, Minnesota Panera Bread is having a hard time finding employees, great.
right. It's like there's a
Burn that
whole
shit down.
it's like, and yeah, there's this whole situation with shortages. Like I haven't had to really deal with it too bad. Like the worst sort, like at worst, like the local like Starbucks that like I'll go to occasionally, like doesn't have like the full menu, which I don't really care about anyway. Like
Societal collapse.
yeah, like it's really like I think what like the Chapo people have been calling it is like the treats. It's like the treats must flow. Like it's just I have seen pictures of like there's no milk in one grocery store or whatever, but it's like, well, I don't want to sound like a third worldist or whatever, but like go to like go to a grocery store in Puerto Rico, and that's just the norm. It's just kind of silly to me that like people are making this whole shortage thing out to be way worse than it actually is. Like no one is going to go hungry because of these shortages. At the worst, like people will be mildly inconvenienced. And I do wonder though if the shortage thing is kind of connected to the strike situation and the labor shortage. Or I've heard that some people say that it's because of just demand is so high right now that it can't meet supply. And so that's what's
Yeah.
really going on. Is they're just basically like overshocked by excess demand, and so they can't meet the amount of supply necessary. And yeah, in the chat, Rudy says there's a lot of talk about how the ports are suffering from bad logistics. But yeah, I'm going to bring a couple more people on, and if you want to stay on and keep talking with us, I'm down. But we're going to start talking about political events in Texas. We got Rudy on here and Joseph. Hey guys, what's going on?
Hey, how's it going, Donald? Hi, Paul.
It's going
Hello.
good.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. It's the first time I've done one of these streams, so it's actually really easy, honestly. Like it all pretty much does all the work for you.
Yeah, I think you've been doing pretty good.
Sweet. So I feel I figured we could talk a bit about recent events in Texas. There was the recent legislation about abortion that brought a lot of headlines and brought a lot of attention to Texas, and there was the new party platform of the Republican Party came out, and that was really something else. So I figured we could talk a bit about that.
Maybe what most people aren't aware, a lot of this is driven because of, we have our governor, Gregory Abbott. He's up for re-election next year, but he's looking to be primaried from the right. And this challenger is actually a mainstream Republican. Like he was part of the administration, but I can't remember the name right now. But he's not like a complete outsider, right? This is someone who was in his administration, is criticizing him from the right and has been politically active for 15, 20 years. And a lot of it is also driven by the fact that Greg Abbott could be successfully primaried from the right. So you have this sort of, mainstream Republicans who are just moving more and more right because they're being, constantly attacked from the right. At the same time, this abortion thing feels like it was coming for a long time, right? They were just waiting to have a clear majority in the Supreme Court. And that's, I guess, what prompted such a strong law to come up. It's not the first one, I feel like, of the abortion laws. It's just the most, like, I guess, extravagant because of this whole snitching clause that you can actually make thousands of dollars because if you snitch on someone who got an abortion illegally, or if you snitch on a doctor who's providing abortions. So I don't know if that, I don't know if that's a good start to this whole thing.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the list of like the stuff that they added.
No, it's not
the...
Alan West. It's, or is it Alan West? It's this other guy. Give me a second. I should have it.
Is this Dan Patrick?
No, Dan Patrick is a lieutenant governor. God. Don Huffines. I don't know how you say it. Well, he's basically criticized Abbott for being too strong on coronavirus, which is absurd. We were the first state to open. And he recently criticized Abbott too for a resource that the Texas state had on its website for LGBTQ people and preventing suicide. And 2 days after he criticized Abbott for this, the website was taken down or something like this. So there's really like a rank and file, for lack of a better word, push to make the Republicans even more of a right-wing party on things. And I feel like these struggles are manifesting around gender for many reasons that, I live in Houston. Houston is 25% white, okay? Texas is becoming less and less and less white. So they can't be overtly racist anymore because they have to bring in large amounts of Latinos and probably Arabs into the Republican Party. So that's why gender, I think, is a preferred battlefield, because you can get all these like second-generation immigrants sold on social conservatism much easier than you can get them sold on more racist policies. Yeah, I think AJ is saying like, yeah, they also own a lot of real estate in Dallas Fort Worth.
Yeah, I think I think a lot about how there's kind of this like these gender wars like are definitely stoked by the right.
Mm-hmm.
Because partly, like you said, you can kind of build a coalition that's multiracial around social conservatism and demographic realities that are making that more and more of a necessity. But also at the same time, like I feel like a lot of this push from the rank and file kind of comes from like local like religious leaders, like just kind of suburban
And yeah, because it's funny. I was yesterday, I volunteer on a farm sometimes. We were yesterday in this farm, and there was this church group of Indians who had come along to the farm. They were all wearing like Jesus t-shirts, in the middle of Texas. And you feel like that, there's so many churches that cater to multiracial, cater to multiracial community, that you can see why this is going to be the building block of American fascism, right? Much more. Of course, anti-blackness is there, but it's subtle, right? It's going to be like a sort of Brazilian anti-blackness that it's going to become not, basically, this is something I've been feeling, and I feel like that's why people should be looking at Texas more and more, because the demographics of Texas is the demographics of the U.S. in the future. And you will have this layer of Black people who've been living here for a very long time, and immigrants coming in will stack above this layer of Black people, but still below the white layer, right? So they have to build this new consent, and gender is going to be a big playing role for this.
Yeah, I just found there's a current affairs article that talks about the Texas GOP's 2020 platform, and has 337 different proposals, but it lists a few of the big ones, and we've got opposing any effort to classify carbon emissions as a pollutant, which is just abolishing the EPA. So there's an repealing the Endangered Species Act. So yeah, right here we got like anti-ecology, which has always been a big thing in the Republican Party, which ties into the capitalist interests that they represent, I think, with the kind of energy sector. So that's really nothing new. But they're straight up calling to prohibit sex education, sexual health, or sexual choice or identity in any public school. Like, that's just absurd. Like, no sex education. Like, those basic, public school sex education, they're trying to get rid of that. They're trying to recognize pornography as a public health crisis, which I mean, whatever critiques we have of the pornography industry, I think it's clear that this is more about regulating sexuality and trying to enforce kind of rigid sexual norms and any kind of feminist critique of pornography or anything. Abolishing child protective services, abolishing the Department of Education, and they're trying to have American history courses heavily weighted towards the study of original founding documents. That's just I think that ties in with the whole critical race theory, moral.
Yeah, the critical race theory. There was a whole thing from the Texas Department of Education recently. They put a tweet out. It was like how to recognize when your child is being taught critical race theory. That honestly looked like some sort of meme, but it came from the department itself, and it was deleted very rapidly. Can't remember what was it, but it was really it was a meme. It looked like a meme more than a real thing.
Yeah. And I wonder how much of this stuff is kind of a backlash, a right-wing backlash to the struggles in 2020. I think a lot of the racism, like you said, it's more subtle, and it's more so going to appeal to this kind of sense of law and order. And I think, and because that makes that kind of appeal, they can get minority and racialized groups on board because they can kind of prove that they're one of the good ones. They're not the bad people and the bad blacks who are out protesting and rioting. They're the good ones. They're gonna be good Americans and follow the law and not get out of place. And so you can basically do all the racism you want, but still be able to get minority votes, especially from the middle class.
Right, and that's maybe why if you're targeting new immigrants, that's why you can target critical race theory. That doesn't matter, because critical race theory is important for the people who've been here for generations, in the sense that recognizing the historical depth this country has to Black and Indigenous people. But in that sense, it's perfectly compatible with new immigrants from Southeast Asia. It's perfectly compatible with new Mexican immigrants. That's imperialism. That's different, right? In a sense, of course, it's all tied together. But what I'm trying to say is, people who've been living here for generations are the ones pushing to get this story taught, not the newly racialized immigrants coming in.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't got to the rest of the platform yet, but the points about critical race theory and some of the other more unhinged portions of the platforms suggest a very QAnon kind of influence on the platform and Republican Party politics generally. I think there's something about banning fluoridation in there.
Oh yeah. Let's see. God, there's a lot of stuff on here. Let me just control F for fluoridation. I spelled that wrong. Very embarrassing.
Yeah.
Wait, how do you spell fluoride? It's FLO.
U.
Yeah.
Yeah, U. But that's
FLUO.
Oh, you. Oh my God. Yeah, everyone now knows how stupid I am. God dang it. Yeah, stopping the fluoridation of water supply. That's just they make if you've seen the movie Doctor Strangelove. They the wacky right-wing people in there, they're going on about how they're making basically it's a takedown of John Birch Society type people, and they're going on about how the communists are fluoridating the water supplies, make Americans more stupid and susceptible to communism. That's just that's a joke, and that's apparently part of this platform. I really
Yeah, what's sort of a hodgepodge of historical kind of, I guess, demands of the right wing of the U.S. and hodgepodge of weird kind of conspiracist things thrown in there, and then some new culture war wedge issues as well, like the drag queen story hour thing.
Yeah, we had the drag queen story time for a big time in Houston going on, because this was one of the worst things that I think has happened to the left in Houston recently. So basically, we had drag queen story time for a while going on in a public library. So week after week, the religious right came to protest it, and week after week, we put up a counter protest. I was there 3-4 times. It generally anything from DSH, Social Alternative, and all other like left-wing groups, doing a very good job. And actually, Drag Queen Storytime was growing and growing. They moved it to a larger place. Turns out they had not done proper vetting, and one of the drag queens was a registered sex offender.
Oh God.
So this was because, you know, I mean, you can be on the list for something that this person had an excuse. They are probably like, you know, got let's say it was some sort of revenge thing. I can probably believe it, you know, that you know, the gay couple at young age dating, one of the parents wants them to put a child sex offender in 18, 17, this kind of thing, I think it was. But still, like you come clean on this. You know, you gave the rights the worst sort of ammo. They
Yeah,
just
you gotta have
came and said,
optics. Yeah, it's optics are actually important. You know, there's a lot of you know, a lot of times people will make stupid arguments in the name of optics, but actually it does kind of matter what kind of optics you have. But
yeah, I mean, the thing is, the mayor of Houston used to be fully behind this. He was saying like, no, this is going on despite you fuckers coming here to protest me. This gets pulled up, it's canceled in 2 days.
Yeah.
Like, optics disaster even for the Democrats in some way.
Yeah.
And again, you know, the people protesting this, a lot of Latinos, a lot of brown people with signs that you're sinners, Jesus will come for you, you're all gonna burn in hell. You know.
Well,
Catholicism.
Sorry. I mean, that goes back to the point that you were making, Rudy, about this coalition that they're trying to spin out of conservative, you know, like Latinos and Black people, which is already, there's evidence that sort of is already taking place. It's already being effective with some of the reports from the last election of a lot of sort of Mexican people who kind of voted for Trump, or apparently, I think Mike Davis had a good post about this, which was like a lot of these border areas, these border districts went for Trump, majority Mexican or something border districts that went for Trump, which is sort of evidence that this coalition is sort of actually cohering.
I mean, this is what I say, like Trump improved the results among every demographic except white men in the last election. Trump is a president who got more people of color to vote for him and more women to vote for him in the history of the Republican Party. Of course, you know, white men still predominantly voted for him.
Yeah.
But still, like, you know, it's not like this thing of, you know, like race gives you a magic progressive card.
Right.
And still, Latinos are going majority for Democrats. Blacks go disproportionately for Democrats, especially in a place like Houston. That's kind of a black belt neocolonial structure. But this might not hold on forever.
Yeah, I think.
I was just, you know, I don't remember. I guess I wanted to get y'all's thoughts on this because I think the question that's always counterposed is like, you know, like the Bush years, right? Like Bush Jr.'s whole selling point in 2000 was that, you know, was that he got a majority of the Latino population in Texas to vote for him. That was a whole compassionate conservative idea, and like, you know, he came close to winning like Hawaii in 2004. So that kind of was happening under Bush. So I guess the question is McCain and Romney, was that just like, you know, was that just like an aberration, or is Trump something, you know, the kind of Trump era politics of Republicans different than like what Bush was doing or what Rick Perry was doing back in the day, and was like Romney just like an abnormally really bad candidate for the Republicans in that sense?
I mean, I haven't been living in the U.S. enough to tell you, but I do remember very clearly that written down, like, you know, Romney should have gotten more Latinos, and now we have Trump, who's going to be a disaster for the Republicans. It's like, dude, like, no. People like Latinos is not in some ways it's not a real term. It's everything from white to black.
Right.
And people who've been living here for years can be very racist to people who are coming in right now. I mean, dude, immigrants can be very racist. Yeah. And I've heard conversations in Spanish about how Donaldo is going to save the country and how he's a businessman. He knows how to run something, like, all sorts of things. And, you know, these are coming from brown people who are speaking Spanish in the bus, in the train. And I feel like, Trump's idea of America first is not necessarily, it's more compatible with some sort of, Bolsonaro idea of fascism. I don't want to call it fascism, but, national identity, quasi-fascist identity, much more than it's compatible with this whiteness, pure white versus black idea that's hegemonic in the US and probably is on its way out, right?
Yeah, I totally think that like there is a change from like Bush and Romney era Republican Party to the Trump era. Like there's obviously continuity. Like the Trump program is still imperialist, even if it kind of talks about like America First style like anti-interventionism. It's still imperialist. It's still ultimately like pro-capitalism, and there's still like it still has like the anti-ecology stuff. There's still like segments of the capitalist class that are behind this, and it's not like a totally like it's not a total shift. There is definitely a shift, I think, towards a more insurgent kind of nationalism. And like there's always like the argument about like is it fascism or not? Like, and I think there's arguments on both sides that have legitimacy, but I think it's there's something new happening here. There's something new happening in this situation where there's this formation. It's an attempt to kind of create this new American identity that's like exclusive, and it's like it's still kind of trying to be civic nationalism, but it's still trying to be like a more exclusive form of that civic nationalism and the kind of like great melting pot liberal narrative that we have here. Like it's more like if you're going to be like a true American, you have to kind of like follow these cultural codes, I guess, is like what it's about. It's like it's about kind of defining the true American as like this socially conservative, anti-liberal, anti-left-wing kind of identity.
I mean, I think there's sort of maybe I listen a lot to the White Theory podcast by Todd McGowan. This idea of enjoyment, right? Mitt Romney was not an enjoyable candidate. He was like a bureaucrat. Trump is, even we have fun sometimes reading the way Trump destroys like Colin Powell and Meghan McCain this week or this other week. Because in the end, there is an enjoyment in supporting Trump in that sense. Like, yeah, he's going to get the country back from us, even if it's complete bullshit. And we all know this. But he's like an enjoyable candidate, much more than Mitt Romney was. And I honestly think he's coming back for 2024. And he's going to coast the Republican primaries because the sensation that he gives his psychological wage to a lot of people is not going to disappear. And people, they can't, people who are not making the real wage still can't take the psychological wage.
Right. It's like, you have like, the way that whiteness kind of formed as a way for like immigrant groups to kind of assimilate into this like hegemonic American identity. Like especially in the post-war era, like I feel like we're kind of seeing something like that, but it's no longer based on like white skin. Maybe like it's like there's kind of this new phase of like a assimilation, I guess, is what we're seeing, that is more capable of like creating a multiracial population. It's more capable of integrating a multiracial population. Okay, I don't know. It's very interesting and it's very disturbing at the same time, and it's very concerning.
Well, it seems more about commitment to an American nationalist project as such. One of which a sort of constituent component of that is an idea of white supremacy, even if it is sort of for a lot of people in a kind of subterranean sense. I don't know how many people are. So, for example, the Black and brown people who are committed to this ideologically, how many of them are overtly white supremacists? But I think that there is, like, as you said, a kind of civic nationalist commitment almost. And I can tell you that it is actually like this ideology is complex in the sense that, for example, I know personally like my uncle who's an immigrant. I don't think he's a citizen. But he is sort of like I've even heard him express like Trumpist, anti-immigrant kind of sentiments, and it's boggling to me that someone who is himself an immigrant could, so just to say that it's like a complex ideology. I don't think it's certainly not rational. I wouldn't call it rational, especially since, and I guess I'll say this about whether Trump or Trumpism or whatever is a qualitative shift in the Republican Party, is that I'd say that it is, in the sense that conspiracism has now become a part of the mainstream of the Republican Party. These people are anti-rationalists. It's like we're no longer dealing with people who are at least nominally tethered to reality. So I think in that sense, it's qualitatively different. I think it's also qualitatively different in the sense that Trump, at least a large basis of his support, came from the idea that he was somehow not an agent of the political system, that he somehow is coming from without the political system. Even though that's not true, the fact is that it was convincing enough to a large amount of people, or a large amount of people were drawn to that idea to vote for him or support him. I think in that sense it's qualitatively different.
Yeah. I think the conspiracy stuff is a big part of it. Like I think we kind of have to take the MAGA people at their word. Like there's the Proud Boys, for example, they would say when they were accused of being racist, well, we're not racist, we're Western chauvinists.
Right.
And I think that's kind of what it is. And I think it gives people who aren't white a chance to kind of assimilate by like proclaiming their loyalty to Western chauvinism.
Yeah, people should be looking much more at Brazil and the formation of race there, because the amount of brown people that voted Bolsonaro, in Brazil, the idea of nationality is a bit different. In America, you're American because you're white, essentially. That's going to change. In Brazil, you're Brazilian because you were born in Brazil.
Yeah.
And I feel like in the US, it's going to move a lot more towards that, especially because, or maybe you're not maybe born in the US, but I think Joseph was saying, you just simulate the cultural symbols. Like you are in Houston and you buy your pickup truck, which you see a lot of, brown people driving around with pickup trucks, a lot of Indians driving around with pickup trucks, Indian Peninsula, Desis, because they're assimilating to here, right? And look at the whole Brazilian national soccer team. Like 85 to 90% of them are all Bolsonaro supporters, and not many of them are white, And I know a lot of brown Bolsonaro supporters. And if you feel like this is some sort of barrier, or it might be a barrier for a few more years, but like Donald is saying, take them at their word. These are giving an option for non-white people to assimilate into Western chauvinism and to feel like the psychological wage, and to get like I'm part of something bigger, a civilization that created, that built the world, essentially, if you want to put it the way they think it is, right?
Yeah, that's actually what the Proud Boys kind of would say. They're just like, oh, we believe that, the West is the best because we created the modern world. And that's what we did, and we deserve credit for that, Just absolutely ridiculous if you think about it historically, like how much the labor of colonized people and immigrants is what created that actually created the world that we know today. Like one thing in the platform, they got requiring mandatory daily pledges to both the United States and Texas, and of course they got the teaching of American history courses heavily weighted to the original founding documents. Just a lot of just really hyper nationalist type stuff, and I think that in the MAGA thing, like the reason why it appeals to people is kind of this like idea that there's a shadowy liberal conspiracy to destroy America and replace it with the rule of the bug men who will make us all live in pods and eat bugs. And
well, I mean that's where gender comes back in, right? Gender is a way that you can reassert the patriarchal family and tradition in a way that is relatively inoffensive. Inoffensive in the way that it doesn't require change at the supra level. Like it's just you are mandating families, right? It's very low cost in a way for the state. It's very punitive. You can you go against abortion doctors, you go against certain people that don't follow the norm. But it's much easier because you're essentially subcontracting this to the family, right? To
Yeah.
enforce authority. And I feel that's where it's coming in again and again.
Yeah, I think like that's really what the whole like transgender panic is about. It's like, there's a relative weakening of the patriarchal norms that enforce gender roles, and transgender people exist outside of those norms. So it's a minority group that you focus on and go after as like a sign of the decline of the patriarchal norms in order to reassert those patriarchal norms. And so
And some Cubans I know were saying, like, if Biden is going to bring us communism, it's going to bring us a cabinet full of transgender ministers or department heads. Like God, I wish.
yeah, it's just it's just ridiculous stuff, but it gets people excited, because I think people have a deep psychological attachment a lot of times to kind of traditional gender norms. I think like this is where psychoanalysis can actually be kind of useful. And not that I really understand psychoanalysis per se, but there is this kind of irrational connection to these kind of traditional ways of encoding gender and sexuality that really gets people upset and gets people bothered. And you have religious leaders, evangelical leaders, like right-wing leaders who get people riled up, who the kind of ideological state apparatuses or whatever, who transmit the ideology to people, get them riled up. And these people, like these kind of right-wing like personalities, they exist in like immigrant communities and stuff. Like I have a Vietnamese friend, and her parents are like really into like the kind of Vietnamese right-wing radio people. Like, I mean, it's Vietnam. It's a lot of people who come from a communist country, so there's obviously a right-wing kind of expat community around it. But nonetheless, like there is this kind of Vietnamese community, like right-wing, talk radio stuff going on. That's obviously also a part of kind of transmitting the ideology to people. And I imagine that exists in all kinds of different places.
Oh, in Houston, it's pretty bad because a lot of the Vietnamese after the war settled here. So it's one of the few places you can still see South Vietnam flags in certain places.
Just right by the Confederate flag. The lost causers. But yeah, another thing, let's look at more of this platform here. Supporting an aggressive war on terrorism. So that's in continuity with the classic Republican stuff. Like, I don't think we're going to see a move away from the kind of like, imperialist, like war on terror part of the Republican Party. But it will, you'll have like, it's also weird because part of the QAnon thing is like this attack on the deep state and this idea that like the deep state is like corrupting true America. And so it's like, well, there's a kind of a contradiction here, right? Like, withdrawing from the United Nations, it's not going to happen. Eliminating all public funding for public broadcasting, like,
with a kind of an odd one.
Yeah, like it's a lot of just like Republican like austerity stuff too. Which kind of just flies in the face.
The PBS thing, that's a holdover from the 90s. I don't know if y'all ever watched the movies of Marlon Riggs, but he's like a really, really influential classic black gay essay filmmaker, and he made this really great film about like the black gay experience, and it got funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and because the idea of having like black gay men on TV was so the Republicans hated it so much they banned the Corporation for Public Broadcasting for ever funding documentary film ever again.
So, oh wow, what's it called?
The movie is it's 2 words.
I think I might have heard of it.
What's it? Marlon Riggs is the director.
Okay, how do you spell that?
Oh, Marlon and Riggs.
Okay, that's what I thought. I want to look into that. Interesting. Is it called Ethnic Notions?
No, I'll come up with it in a second.
He's done a few different movies. I see. There's done Tongues Untied, Ethnic Notions, Color Adjustment.
Tongues Untied, that's it.
Yeah, okay. He's done it. Black is, Black ain't. Yeah, that's interesting. PBS actually does have some quality stuff sometimes.
It's interesting you have eliminating birthright citizenship after all we talked about there.
Yeah, I mean it's very like
That
you
is a
think that-
white supremacist talking point.
yeah. I mean that's the thing though, is I think you can still get minority groups on board with this stuff because it's a way to assimilate. So I think it's part of neo-colonial type capitalism. I think is part of the methods of control is you have to is basically the assimilation of the dominated minority groups in this situation.
It's like pulling the ladder up, like pulling the ladder up after you've used it. Like you're in and you shut the door behind you.
Yeah. And it's just another thing is like, the Democratic Party is just so useless. Like they're not actually like able to oppose this stuff. Like
I could talk for hours on like the Texas walkout. The Democrats actually walked out of the legislature to complain to Washington and stayed there, and then came back and got nothing in return after 2 months. That's still one of the most insane moves I've seen. Like everybody was cheering them on, like, "Hey, you guys finally grew a spine because they walked out over a voting rights bill," and then. No, they just went back in and capitulated and got the voting bill after 2 months of losing time. It's like, why the fuck you do that anyway then?
It's completely performative.
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of stuff like that, even at a federal level, they've been completely ineffectual. I mean, with the abortion ban in Texas, there's been no federal challenge of what's essentially an illegal. I mean, if I understand Roe v. Wade correctly, it's an illegal bill. There should be some kind of like.
There's a challenge coming up. It's just going to take a lot of time. But there's no federal challenge. I mean, all the challenges is starting, I think, because a doctor in San Antonio said, "Fuck it, I'm still performing abortion, sue me."
Yeah.
And then that's how the challenge started. But yeah, I mean, didn't Hillary Clinton have a VP choice that was pro-choice, anti-abortion?
Yeah.
I think like this Tim Kaine guy or whatever he was called.
Yeah. He was a Hyde Amendment guy. I don't think he was totally pro-life, but he was basically like for like limiting it. He's like one of those guys. Well, I can't totally get rid of abortion, but we have to make it so that it's a challenge to get or whatever, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And right now we're having another like redistricting in Texas, so it's going to be kind of for 2022. They're basically cut. We have really bad districts. Luckily, my congressperson is Al Green. He's like a black union guy, but they're going to redistrict Houston and pitch the two longest standing black Democrats against each other, which are going to be Al Green versus Sheila Jackson Lee, who've both been there for decades. They're both like black union people. And, it's like the Democrats can't do shit to stop it. And the Republicans are slowly losing their majority at the Congress level. But, governorship, they're going to run fucking Beto O'Rourke because he's the kind of guy who primary voters love, but everybody else despises.
Yeah. Like,
and they're going to lose again.
Yeah. It's like, God, like it's like his big thing is guns too, which is like the worst like issue you can focus on. If you want to like, because like honestly, like in Florida, like I know a lot of people who vote Republican just over the gun issue. Like if it was not for the gun issue, they probably would not even vote, or they would maybe even vote Democrat. So it's just such a terrible like issue to focus on.
Democrats are also kind of intent on fighting this sort of cultural war in Texas, because Austin, you always want to joke that Austin wants to be California in Texas, and Houston is kind of growing. It's more cosmopolitan, democratic oriented people, much more than the usual, black belt neo-colonial democratic machine. But it's still not large enough. If you want to win, don't go after cultural symbols. Go after bread and butter. It's really easy in Texas. I feel like if they went after bread and butter, they get a much larger voting percentage. And you're somehow seeing, because this is kind of a weird theory I have. But before they always have, in the primaries, You get the guy who's most likely to be elected, the most centrist, and then he can compete in general. But nowadays it's the opposite. The centrist is the least likely to be elected. So Democratic primary voters just love their centrists. Like even like fucking Beto O'Rourke. But Beto is never gonna be governor of Texas. You'd have way more bigger of a chance with, say, a small Latino version of Sanders in Texas than you would have with Beto O'Rourke in a landslide, right?
Yeah, it doesn't mean you have to like give up on the cultural issues or even like be neutral on them. It just means like, it's you put your focus on class issues, and you while still having like a multicultural and progressive.
Right, but I'm saying more cultural issues like we want to take off your burgers, take out your guns, take off your SUVs.
Exactly, stuff like
not
that.
Even like good ones like LGBTQ rights or this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, SUVs are a terrible idea, but you know what I mean, right? The things that are only bound to get people pissed off.
Well, we make it a struggle about democratic rights, not like a culture war. That's the problem with like the Democrats, is that they like have just like it's they frame everything as kind of like we're like the good, educated, enlightened, like college people who, do the right things and buy the right products, and you're all like, just backwards hicks who just want your guns and Bibles and
What's my sense that? Sorry.
No, go for it.
But it's my sense that the Democrats, I mean, that's a sort of purposeful feature of their political strategy. They don't want to talk about class issues, because on the worst end of the spectrum, they would have to acknowledge that they don't have any positive contributions to that for the majority of the working class, or the working class as such. And the other end of that, it'd be that they have to acknowledge that they're not a working class party. They don't represent working class interests. So I think it's the idea. I also think that my personal kind of somewhat harebrained idea is that they like to appear ineffectual, incompetent, etc. in public. It gives them the out. It's like this whole like Sinema and Joe Manchin discourse that ad nauseum carries on every few months. Whenever something doesn't happen, or when something falls apart, it's Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema. But you got. I find it hard to believe that two people can gum up the works to the extent that like nothing gets done, or that everything has to be every negotiation about like legislation has to be filtered through the considerations of these two people. It would seem to me that like it's a very deliberate strategy on the part of the leadership of the Democratic Party to pin it on these two people. That way in public they can appear to be the good cop, right? The good cop to like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema's bad cops.
Yeah, but even like it's a bit different. If you think about what Paul was saying earlier, you have Democratic people in the Midwest. They're still like union people to some shape or form. Democratic people in Texas, like in 2020, like if they're union people, they're usually black, and they're related to public service unions. Like that's what we have in Houston. Yeah, so there's other unions, but there's basically almost no unions in Houston. And then there's nothing else aside from that. You have people like Cuellar, who's in the border, right? And this guy is basically a Trump Democrat, and he's he isn't even like he's to the right of most Democrats. And they're like this small neo-colonial governors in some shape or form, especially alongside the border. They're not progressive by any means or matters. That's why you see the border counties shifting Republican in the last election. These people are neo-colonial representatives in shape or form. So, with the massive moving on of more, let's say, educated white people into Democrat-leaning young people into Austin, into Houston, then it's when you see this Beto O'Rourke phenomena coming up 3 years ago or whatever. Everything is linked.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like like I've like the thing is that you have to like going back to the primaries. So the big voting blocks right now are in the suburbs. Who the suburbs of Austin and the suburbs of Houston and the suburbs of Dallas are like Plano's area in Dallas that's going really Democratic right now. Yeah, economic stuff like doesn't really they're like, you know, that stuff doesn't really fly out there, like, and it's true out here in Minnesota too. Like, I remember canvassing for Bernie in 2020, and it was in a kind of suburban area, and they're like, "What's his policy on guns?" And I'm like, "What?" Like, you know, like, and they're like, "That's my big," you know. There is the reverse. Like, there are people whose big issue is gun control. So, you know, the more it shifts to the suburbs, yeah, like a guy like Beto really appeals to, you know, someone in the suburbs of Houston, more than you know, more than other candidates. So, like that, I think at the end, like it would be like that's like a class-based program in the Democratic Party isn't going to happen because its base doesn't want that. They want, you know, they actually, like, you know, they want to talk about, like, you know, how the Republicans hate their vaccines and, you know, and love their guns and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think like the kind of suburban Democrat, like anti-gun thing is kind of like they're really obsessed with like safety. I think like their main control is like we want to be in the suburbs and away from crime, and we want our kids to be safe, and we want stability, and guns are potential like introduction of instability. So you know we got to keep the guns out of people's hands. But other people, like, you know, there is this kind of you know, there's this kind of almost like settler kind of like, you know, I'm an individual guy with a gun who's gonna like protect my house, my suburb, my plot of land from the scary brown people, and this is like, you know, my home is my castle, and I'm going to stand here and defend it. And you know, there's also a lot of people in rural areas who just like guns, like as a hobby. And like, I understand why. Like I understand why people like guns. I understand why people find the right to bear arms to be important. Like, I don't think it's a completely irrational thing. I think the way it is expressed in America, though, is often very backwards and very reactionary. But I don't think it necessarily has to be reactionary.
Yeah,
but that's just kind of an aside on that.
it seems like an outgrowth of the super individualist culture or philosophy of the U.S.
Yeah.
It's interesting that the crime thing is interesting to me because it's very much one of those things that's to me at least very manufactured. There's a whole, like here in New York City, for example, there's a somewhat of a discourse about the rising crime in New York City, which I think is really amusing in the sense that I don't really see any crime here.
Yeah.
It's actually, and you know, we have both of our mayoral candidates running on a crime platform. You have the Eric Adams, the Democrat.
Yeah, the Eric Adams guy,
right, who won amazingly enough for a Democratic candidate the endorsement of the PBA, which usually doesn't happen. And you have the Republican candidate Curtis Sliwa, who, if people don't know him, was this like weird vigilante guy in the 70s or 80s. He started this like group called Guardian Angels.
Yeah, the Guardian Angels.
Yeah.
My mom was telling me about them. You know, they would like be on the subways, like, you know, keeping their eyes open for crime and stuff.
Yeah, they're really goofy. They're like they run around with jackets and like red berets, and then they think that they're like, you know, like crime fighters. It's actually pretty goofy to see in person.
Yeah, it is.
But it's one of those things that really, like, from what I can tell, also exploded. I mean, historically, after this one incident in New York City, this guy Bernard Goetz, who had shot somebody on a subway car, and this was around, I think this was like 90s.
Yeah, I think I heard about the Bernard Goetz thing.
Yeah, Bernard Goetz. It was a big deal in the city because it was sort of the capstone to say, well, you see, crime is out of control. And, you know, partly on that is what I believe Giuliani got elected, who also ran on like a real tough on crime platform. But I think it's really weird because it's also partly a reaction to the Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Right. Uprising, which in New York was really like exploded and led to a lot of confrontation with police. And a lot of investigation into like police misconduct, because it turns out that the cops were like really messing people up. Like there was one incident in the Bronx where they had kettled a demonstration of Black Lives Matter protesters. There was at the time a curfew at around 6 or so, and they kettled protesters. They wouldn't allow them to leave until it was 6 o'clock, and then they bashed everyone's heads in.
Yeah.
Turns out that they investigated that. Turns out that that was, obviously they were not doing what they were supposed to, quote unquote. But yeah, the crime thing is actually like, it is like an operative discourse. People are actually buying into it, which I think is.
I mean, is there any truth to it? Like, is there actually a raise in crime that people are noticing that isn't just kind of like, I don't know. I think if there is a raise in crime, I think it is something to consider. Like, maybe it is something we need to think about in our program. It's like, how do we convince people that we're actually going to make changes to society that aren't going to lead to more people getting mugged.
Right.
Like I do think that's a concern, but at the same time, like there is like, how much is this a real thing, and just completely like a kind of discourse type psyop to like convince people to side with the established order.
I think it's, well, I will say that on paper compared to last year, crime is up. Just
right.
Statistically, but it really depends. You have to ask yourself how crime is defined, how it's recorded, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, is it violent crime? Like, are more people just like randomly being murdered? Like, something like that. Or is it just like more people are like, getting like busted for jaywalking? Like, what is the crime that's on the rise? You can't just look at pure numbers. You got to look at the qualitative phenomena.
Right. That's a question. And what I would say is, crime is one of those things that for lack of a better term, is overdetermined, in the sense that, well, in the last year or two, what are some of the factors that we have seen that could contribute to a rise in crime? Well, one of which is, there's been a pandemic. There's been a very, there's been a virus that has been,
right. There's an economic crisis, basically.
Right, an economic crisis. People have been displaced. People have been put out of work. They're not paying their rent. In general, people are more desperate. So that's one factor, along with the evictions. But another factor that I can also point to is, at least here in New York City, is that they started letting homeless people out of shelters, like, because of the contagion risk.
Right.
We started letting them out, and naturally, a lot of these people are also, coincides with mental, like people with mental health issues.
Right.
And to me, it doesn't seem like it's that difficult to figure out why, if crime is going up, why it is. It's
right. You have homeless people, putting them out of the shelter, they're going to have to survive somehow. Like, that's just a reality of capitalism.
Yeah.
Like, I think the issue is that the capitalism is going to produce crime, because it's fundamentally a mode of production that like requires unemployment, and it's not oriented around meeting people's needs, and it creates a class system where people are dispossessed, and they are denied access to the fruits of labor, and so
right, exactly,
people resort to crime to get by. It's just a reality of the situation.
When your means of subsistence are commodities, when your housing is a commodity, etc., even your mental health services are a commodity, naturally, any extended period of economic dislocation will cause a mass of desperate people.
Yeah.
It's been, to say, in terms of like how socialists should approach that, I think we need to acknowledge that crime is a factor in people's sort of political decision making. People have an idea that they want to live in a safe society, I suppose. They don't want crime. So it is important to address that. I think it's important to address that without resorting to reactionary tropes.
Right.
like common right-wing tactics in framing crime as like a symptom of an over-liberal society, so to speak. I think that the way to do it, though, is to sort of ideologically attack notions of crime, kind of getting at what is crime in a social sense, where it comes from, and trying to have a debate about, well, the source of crime is social in nature, and we need to tackle these problems in a social, sense. That's what I would say, because I think that there's also this sort of notion that, let me see if I don't know. There's this notion that's like, well, there's not going to be any sort of, quote, for lack of a better term, policing function, I guess, in a socialist society, like a sort of I don't know what that's going to look like.
Right.
Yeah, I imagine that the character of policing will be different in the sense that the police will no longer be a sort of alien body above society, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Talking about like a militia, militia of people who organize, a social society organizing itself into militias of people with public safety positions will have a completely different social and class character.
Right.
That to me doesn't obviate the sort of necessity of like public safety as a function.
Right, exactly. Like I think what the left needs to be looking at right now and thinking about really seriously is how do we create a vision of public safety that doesn't rely on capitalist policing, and that isn't just like a worse version of what we have now. Like we don't want to just like replace the capitalist police with the secret like police who are going to just be more brutal or whatever, but towards our enemies or whatever. Like I think in a revolutionary situation, like you're going to have armed, there's going to be armed repression. That's just the reality of it. But the question is how it's organized, for what ends, and
the accountability of these repressed.
Yeah, how are they held accountable to the community that they are representing? And I think there needs to be a serious discussion in the left on how we create a vision of this that's palatable to the public. And I don't have the answers per se. I think in Marxist Unity, the group that we're forming in DSA in our founding statement, we do talk about how we need to oppose police budgets and military budgets and create like a new vision of public safety based on the people's militia. But it's still like you talk with people about these kind of things, and they're like, well, what does that look like? And
it's always the most common question from people is like, well, what do you mean? Like, we're just going to let criminals run wild or whatever, which is obviously not a desirable state of affairs. But it's a matter of sort of understanding that people have an idea of a society. In a lot of ways, their idea of society coincides with the society we live in now. But there are actual concerns that you need to address that people sort of bring up.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of the left, they dismiss these things, but we have to take it seriously. I've already said that too many times, but I think there needs to be serious and intelligent discussion on this stuff. I think, like, when the protests of 2020 were going on, there were some people who were just kind of like, oh, this all anti-police thing is just a neoliberal plot to privatize the police and replace them with private security. And I don't think that's true.
Well, this is on the left?
Yeah, just kind of like in the like anti-Paul class reductionist, quote unquote, left, just kind of like the more economistic social dem left are saying, oh, what we need is just better wages, better jobs, and that will solve the problem. We don't actually, it's just too unpopular of an issue to talk about opposing the police right now, because you look at the polls, like the majority of people support the police or at least trust them to keep them safe. And so it's just a losing issue to go after the police right now. And so therefore we should just focus on,
Yeah.
pure bread and butter issues, because that will be enough to reduce crime. And I think there is like one thing I was thinking is like, if there actually is a crime problem, like we don't push for more police, we push for better public services to reduce poverty. And if we can demonstrate a reduction in crime, then we can make a case for like you actually this is a better way of reducing crime, and the police create more problems than they need. So let's cut police budgets. I think that's an answer to maybe how to handle these things in the sense of like advocating for direct reforms right now. Because there's like the sense of like, what do you do if you're like India Walton, for example, and you're elected as the mayor of Buffalo, New York, and you have to like deal with public safety under capitalism. Like, how do you deal with that? Like, I don't really think it's viable for her to just abolish the police in Buffalo. I don't think it's politically possible.
Yeah.
But then there's a question of, okay, so what do you do about it? But then there's a separate question of our minimum program. Like, what are we fighting for as a replacement for a new regime that we're trying to create? Like, what kind of public safety do we want to create if we're completely like, starting fresh and breaking with the current state order?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a question. I mean, I think at this point, the left we're not going to have much say in that discussion. I mean, the idea of defund the police, which, came up originally in the uprisings a year or so ago, which have become completely sort of, mangled, confused. I'm not really sure what defund the police really means at this point.
No, it's been so contested by all these different political visions, and there isn't really one answer about what it means.
It's definitely contested terrain politically and ideologically. One in which the left, isn't going to have much of they're not going to have much of a say in it, because we're not an organized force. We're not organized enough as a force to have the debate and force mainstream political forces to respond or be able to like ideologically contest these notions. Last year when the uprising, though, that's such a shift in public consciousness happened because, so many people got out, and sort of by the weight of their having been in the street for months or whatever, kind of forced a shift on that. But we're back to the sort of status quo ante, which is sort of like, okay, I don't think anybody's actually seriously campaigning on this at this point. And we can't really make any dent in the discourse because we're not really a force.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit adventurous, I would say, to sort of leap straight into the idea of like, get rid of the police, like sort of a maximalist position in that sense.
Yeah, and but at the same time, like we don't want to like push against like people who are fighting against the police, and
no, absolutely not.
So it's a tough line to walk. I think it's a very tough line to walk.
Yeah. Oftentimes it also doesn't help that it coincides with abstentionist positions vis-a-vis like electoral politics.
Yeah, it's basically saying we don't need to participate in politics. We just need to do like street protests and street action. But I think as our movement grows, as we mature politically, I think we'll start developing better answers to these kind of questions. We'll start taking these issues seriously, and I think the 2020 movement is absolutely a positive force in the sense that it's kind of forced this issue onto the left,
right?
And it made us seriously think about this issue, and it touches on a key aspect of the repressive capitalist state, and I really think that it's in a sense it's a gold mine for Marxists that this is like becoming a part of the public discourse, because it gives us a chance to really have something important to say to people.
Yeah, I agree. I think, a lot of people really have come around to anti-police sort of political position since then. It's, I mean, in a lot of ways, a political mainstream position. It can only
Right.
be, it can only have been mangled and co-opted if it's, you know, if it's breached into the mainstream, or if, you know,
Exactly.
yeah.
It's like, I don't know, like 10 years ago, I never would have imagined that it was like a public mainstream conversation on whether we should abolish the police.
Yeah, that I wouldn't have imagined even 3 years ago, until those, you know, that movement exploded, which was actually really exciting. I was actually disappointed that, somewhat, you know, predictably, that it became. I mean, a few months in, it was basically like the more radical voices sort of receded, and then more the NGO-ish types began to really lead that whole thing. And then, you know, of course, funneling it into like an effort to to elect Joe Biden, which is always that's always a problem, which is that these energies are always funneled into dead ends.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of what happened with the first wave of Black Lives Matter in Ferguson, unfortunately. I think a lot of people kind of forgot about what happened there. But yeah, the same kind of, you know, Democratic Party machine was able to kind of step in and co-opt things. So, and it just shows the need for serious political thinking and political leadership, and the left needs to actually take up the task of developing independent politics.
Right.
Anyway, I think we should end here. I think we had a really good discussion today. We talked about a lot of different stuff, but it's been, I don't know how people do this streaming thing all day. Like, it's like,
Yeah,
people do like marathon streams.
yeah,
They'll,
it
like,
is.
stream
It
for
is a
like
marathon, not a sprint.
9 hours. Like, it's just like, oh my god, how do people do this? Like, but hey, I enjoy it. And for everyone who's still listening, I think there's only like 8 people listening right now. Thanks for tuning in. Please subscribe to our channel. If you subscribe, you'll get notifications when we're on. Hopefully, we'll be doing a lot more of these. Maybe we'll do some online gaming, even. You know, who knows? But yeah, thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Joseph, for coming on. Thanks for Rudy and Paul for coming on earlier. I really appreciated that. And let's see, how do I end? Oh, it just end stream. Sweet. All right. Goodbye, comrades.
Right.